Welcome everybody, and thank you so much for joining us for this special Pride event. My name's Dawn Hunter, I'm the Project Manager at the Scottish AI Alliance, and I'm extremely pleased to welcome our two guests today. First up, we have researcher and writer from the University of Washington, Oz Keys. Oz studies gender, disability, and the politics of both AI and medicine. They're an inaugural recipient of the Ada Lovelace Fellowship, and their work has been published in a range of different titles, as wide-reaching as the Feminist Philosophy Quarterly to Vice and Wired. So hi, Oz. Next up, we also have Fiona McAra. Fiona leads a person-centred design team at the Scottish Government, and that is supporting the development of a new national care service. She's currently the head of practice for service design at the Scottish Government and has previously worked on the implementation of social security benefits that have been devolved to Scotland, and has integrated a person-centred approach to design and delivery throughout this. So I'd like to welcome both of you, Oz and Fiona. Thank you so much for being here. The structure of today's event, we will have presentations from each of our speakers. So Oz will be speaking around the key questions of how queerness and human-centred AI align, if indeed they do, particularly in case studies that look at gender. And then we'll move on to hear from Fiona, who will look at what human-centred means in the context of delivering big digital services. And throughout the presentations, I encourage you to submit your questions via the chat function. I'll be keeping an eye on them, just in order for us to be able to keep to time, because we're quite a packed schedule for a small amount of time. I will field your questions to Oz and Fiona once they have presented their talks, and that will happen in the second half of our event. So I think you've heard quite enough from me at the moment. So without further ado, I'd like to present to you Oz Keys, who will be speaking about human-centred AI and queerness. So Oz, over to you.
Thank you so much. Hello, it's lovely to be here, and I'm really grateful to everyone for coming. I mean, I guess technically I don't know what hour it is, but I've generally operate from the assumption that if it is extremely early for me, it's extremely late for the UK. So thank you all. I'm just going to set up my slides. Here we go. Can everyone see the slides? Hooray. Okay, yes. Let's go from here then. So hi, yes, as Dawn lovely introduced me, I am Oz Keys. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Washington. I do a lot of work on biomedicine, AI, surveillance. I do a lot of work on following dogs around and telling dogs that they are extremely good boys / girls / nobody cares. And also hunting for jobs, although no offense, but not in Scotland until you divorce the transphobes down south. You get that done, we can talk. And I'm here today, I guess, to talk about the sort of overlaps between the overlaps and also the contrast between what we think of as AI development and AI development processes and how that's traditionally approached, and how it's approached around with this notion of human-centered AI or human-centered machine learning, depending on who you speak to. And in particular, the different and sometimes depressingly similar impacts that both approaches can have on queer and trans lives. So when we talk about conventional AI, what we're really talking about, the thing that makes it conventional, is the development process itself. It tends to follow a model that the academics like to call technical rationality, right? Which is you have a problem, you apply logic and reason and new shiny technology to that problem until the problem goes away. And as this suggests, with its dependence on like being able to marshal these sort of big infrastructural resources, it tends to be very, very top down. And as a consequence of the idea of like, take rationality, apply, repeat, it often in practice looks like, this is something we already do, but faster. If you look at basically any of the things which are being heralded as, what was the phrase I heard recently, the fourth industrial revolution, or the something, or like everyone's talking about how AI is going to disrupt everything and change everything. And if we do what they say, then we'll have rainbows and unicorns everywhere. And if we don't do what they say, then we'll be throwing up rainbows and unicorns and it'll be horrible. So we should definitely give those nice people from like PwC or Accenture all of our money. They like to emphasize how different things are, but conventional AI and how it's designed and also what it tends to be applied to really tends to be things we already do, but faster or more efficient, or not really either, but we can probably fire some people because we've sold it as being more efficient. And so we don't need all these warm bodies around. I am not always this cynical, I promise. Sometimes I'm asleep. But luckily, we have this idea, you know, I'm not the first or fifth or 50 billionth person to see these problems. And so one response has been to advocate for human-centered AI, which is a lot like queerness insofar as any two people talking about it do not agree on the same definition of what it is. But the definition that I run into a lot is basically this idea of human-centered AI is AI that is a collaboration between sort of human expertise and knowledge and involvement and AI systems. And in the context of design processes, what this looks like is often described as sort of participatory design or collaborative design. Like it shouldn't just be top-down and one size fits all. Instead, it should be nuanced and thoughtful and, you know, involve the actual people that are being impacted by the system that's being designed or being replaced. And there are a lot of reasons to be hopeful around this, at least in comparison to the status quo from a queer perspective, because AI as it's commonly construed and the AI development process that's usually undertaken tend not to be great for queer and trans people. Generally speaking, even without getting into like pure philosophy, but just getting into history, there aren't many instances of people at the top of the food chain making decisions for everyone else that tend to work out for the people at the bottom. And so in theory, human-centered AI should be a lot better, particularly in human-centered AI design, right? We should be able to go, okay, look, here is a process that actually includes the people who it's being designed for. There is conscious effort to address the fact that a one-size-fits-all solution, a top-down solution, is not going to cover everything. Everything is swell. But in practice, that's not quite what it ends up looking like, as I know that Fiona is also going to talk about, and probably a lot more eloquently and with a lot more expertise. And as a case study in this, I want to present the question of voice-activated AI, or voice-activated AI assistants, depending on who you ask. Basically, things like Alexa or Siri. They're ubiquitous, they're spreading even further, as I find out every single time I try and just phone any company's customer service system. And they've been widely studied from like the perspective of people interested in questions of gender norms and questions of politics. And this is for a variety of reasons. The major one from a sort of, I guess, like in terms of like scale of impact or obvious perniciousness of impact, is the simple fact that all of these systems tend to be gendered as feminine. Every time they design a system that is designed to be an assistant or a PA or anything else, they end up saying things like, well, users just preferred yelling at a device that sounded feminine. And it's like, okay, cool, users preferred that, but is that really? There are a lot of things users prefer. 2-year-olds prefer sticking coffee beans up their nose because they're 2. They think that everything is worth asking the question, does it go up my nose? Does that mean that we just let them? And so there's been a lot of effort to address this by including a wider range of voices, by including like different defaults. But there's also been this concern kind of accompanying this that it's actually a really narrow range of voices, right? And it's a narrow range of gendered voices. You can have conventionally gendered masculine and feminine voices in a range of, you know, English and American accents, and maybe one Australian. And so there's been some concern that this reinforcement of the idea that voices are gendered and that there are two voices with two genders and et cetera, could have like unpleasant impact on trans communities, particularly on non-binary people whose gender expressions or presentations or identities do not fit neatly into that binary. And so one human-centered AI design approach that was taken was something called Project Q, which was self-described by one of the organizers, Julie Carpenter, as the world's first non-binary voice, although actually she described it as more than the world's first non-binary voice, because it's well known that you can only design something for queer people and get resourcing for it and justify it if you can explain how it's for everyone else too. And so nobody needs to yell about taxpayers. But it was a participatory effort to design a voice that was gendered in a non-binary way, is how they phrase it sometimes, but we'll get onto that. The development process itself was open, participatory, collaborative. The resulting software can be relicensed pretty easily, so it can be integrated into products. And it was done in active collaboration with Copenhagen Pride and several other Swedish and I believe Danish queer groups. And all of this sounds really good, right? It sounds very human-centered. The problem is that in execution, you end up with some issues. So why is my slide? Here we go. So what they did in terms of like design methods was they recorded the voices of 6 people who identify as male, female, transgender, or non-binary, and they tried to use this to blend a voice that didn't fit within the typical binary. And then they surveyed 4,600 people on some variants of this voice, and basically asked, like, you know, which ones do you prefer? Which one, you know, try and assess the gender of this voice. And they ended up with a modulated single voice that fit within a frequency range that was perceived as most gender neutral. And here you can see some pretty obvious slippage, right? Which is this idea of, you know, we're trying to be inclusive, we're trying to be representative. We recognize that there are more than 2 ways of being gendered. There must be 3 ways of being gendered. That's our conclusion. Like, there's still this reductive move to say that, okay, like our category system is wrong. So you're saying we need one more fixed category, right? That presents in exactly the same way. Like the idea that the gendering of voices is a problem, or that the conflation of being non-binary and being gender neutral and sitting equidistant between feminine classed and masculine classed like ranges, like none of those get questioned. And so even though this is, you know, intended to be very, very considerate, inclusive, you know, it involved large scale surveys. It involved like collaborations with queer rights groups and activist groups. In practice, it doesn't really go as far as it needs to. In fact, it really reinforces some of the underlying tropes that should be challenged here. And the reason for this, I think, is that there is a very fundamental mistake in how people are constructing and then executing the idea of, you know, human-centered AI design or participatory design or so on and so forth. And that is basically, it's understood as participatory answering, by which I mean, it's the same people who decide what the questions are that matter. It's the same people who decide what the range of acceptable answers to give are. But because you're actually asked instead of told, that's better, right? And in theory, it is better, but it misses out some really important things. And in this case, one of the really important things that is missed by this is the question of whether we actually want representative voice assistants at all, like whether that is the problem with voice assistants, because, you know, these things are hooked up to Jeff Bezos's bank account and okay, it's more complex than that, but they all eventually end up there. It's hooked up to these big systems of surveillance infrastructure. We are increasingly squirrely about collectively, and frankly, queer communities have had more reasons than most to be worried about questions of surveillance to begin with. In fact, that's one of the reasons that there's always been a strong queer presence in places like the internet, was this need to escape surveillance in other domains. So myself and a couple of friends actually did the hitherto unconceived or unheard of idea of, instead of designing a sort of, trans-inclusive voice-activated AI system, we actually went out and spoke to other trans people about whether they wanted this in the first place, which none of the people involved in Q had thought to do. And unsurprisingly, the response was somewhere between no and not actively opposed, but it's so far down my to-do list that I really could not care less. People do not necessarily want to be represented in this way, to be included and co-opted into systems of data extraction that are treating them as an object, and prioritizing this question of like, okay, but in what way would they best like to be exploited? Might be participatory or human-centered on the lid, but in practice, it doesn't work out that way. And so I think the real potential of human-centered AI that is being missed here, and I'm trying to turn it into an optimistic thing, right? Because my advisor has been pointing out that you can't just go places, make everyone phone their doctor for a new sertraline prescription, and then leave. You tend not to get invited back. Is that there is actually potential here which is being missed, which is that if we have these participatory methods and approaches and so on and so forth, which predate AI, a lot of them, we can use those to ask better questions, not just to try and get a broader range of answers. Like, why don't we go out and ask what people want before we come up with our great, like, wonderful idea that could definitely not backfire in any way, shape, or form? Why don't we actually let the process of determining what is built, as well as how it is built, be determined by the communities that we're meant to serve? And I think the reason for this, and I'll shut up after this, is really twofold. The first is, I think that it's a bigger, more structural change than it sounds like on the surface, right? That ideal of being driven by what people actually need and being adaptable is really, really attractive as a thing to say that you're doing, but actually runs counter to a lot of the practices in a lot of places. But the second is that I think that people have gone too far with this idea of AI is disruptive and it's changed everything. And when it changes everything, or when you're told that it changes everything, you think that none of the lessons you've learned so far apply because this is a new world. This is a fourth industrial revolution. But they actually do. That's the crucial thing. It hasn't changed everything. It hasn't changed the need to actually engage with users. It hasn't changed the fact that we live in democratic and participatory environments, and that ultimately a system that isn't designed for users is a system they're either going to rework or walk away from or be miserable under, depending on the relations of power. These aren't things that we need to learn anew with AI. We learned them in the 19th century, right? We learn them from the unions. We learn them from the right to vote and the fight for it. Like, you either take into account the actual people who the system is built on and for and around, or it falls over, or they do. And rather than emphasizing, in other words, how different everything is now that we have like machine learning and it can play a halfway decent game of chess, I think it's worth emphasizing the continuity, the fact that some of these are not new problems. They're the same problems that anyone building anything in the public eye and public domain has been having to grapple with for a century and change. And rather than try and reinvent everything from whole cloth, we can listen to the people we're working with and listen to the people we're working for and get a lot further. So that's everything. I almost definitely ran over time because once I get on a tear about this time it's different. AI has changed everything. I'm no longer responsible for my actions. Happy to hold like all the questions to the end. I don't know how you want to structure this.
Thanks very much for that, Oz. That was really interesting, and yeah, really fascinating stuff. We have a couple of questions. I think I will hold them until after Fiona has spoken. So yeah, and I would keep encouraging everybody to keep adding their questions into the chat as well, and we can have a little bit of a discussion after our next speaker, Fiona, who is going to be discussing human-centered design and its implementation into big services. So on you go, Fiona.
Thank you. Hopefully you guys can see my slides. I see nobody shaking their heads, so I'm going to take that as a yes. Fab, thank you. So hello, I'm Fiona. Dawn touched on at the beginning some of the stuff I've been involved in. In this context, important things to note. I work for Scottish Government. My views do not represent everybody that works there. The other thing is I'm not an AI specialist, but I am a specialist in human-centered design. You may also call it user-centered or person-centered, but I've been working on how we implement that kind of approach across big services, particularly within public sector, so mostly government, over the last, I don't know, 5-7 years. So yeah, I think that what I'm about to say probably meshes quite well with what Oz touched upon, but probably from more of a view of how we deliver those kind of projects and with those kind of ethics at its heart. So I'll do my best to be a little more uplifting about how we do get those things in place. Although don't hold me to, you may need a stiff drink at the end. So broadly speaking, what I want to talk about is human-centered design in the context of new technologies, such as AI. As Oz mentioned, technology is, the idea of new technology coming in as a way to solve problems is not new. And for me, there are probably some parallels that I can pull out around how we are seeing it pointed towards as the magic solution to everything, even if we don't know what the problem is. So let's talk a little bit more about that. So talking about human-centered design, depending on your background, this may be very familiar, it may not be, but essentially what we do is we focus on the needs of users. And what we have as key questions there is, who are the users? So from my perspective, often that is, yes, people who are using a product or a service, but it might also be the people who are delivering that service or people who have a vested interest. So we talked there about the kind of voice assistants. It would be arguable to say, for example, that in the Alexa situation, Jeff Bezos might be a user. He might be very well represented in his interests and how those things are designed. What kind of needs do we need to consider? That's a lot of needs in one question. In this space, what I'm meaning to get at there is we have different segments of the population generally, and different people with different experiences, and they will have very different needs. And we need to consider in that situation, what is the potential for harm in our design decisions? So some things seem like pretty innocuous decisions, but they're not going to be when they're implemented. And I'll talk a wee bit more about that as we go on. So in the context of technologies, people get really excited about new things because suddenly we don't need to do the stuff we were doing before. We've got this shiny new thing that is 100% going to solve all of the problems. And we have we need an app situation. So I'm a service designer by trade, and we have historically always had people coming to us and saying, everything's broken, we don't know how to fix it, we need you to help. And they will then give you a little bit of preamble and they'll say, I think we need an app. And you say, okay, well, we need to understand, like, why do you think you need an app? And actually, do we know what the problem is? Why people aren't engaging with the service in the way you would expect? Are there access issues? Do these people even have things that can have apps on them? And the response is, but we need an app. Everybody else has got an app. It's an app. And I've got here a very small snippet from Google. And this is no longer the case, but there was a point in time where NHS had 46 different apps. I believe that was not the highest number. So this is people trying to access what I would see is arguably a single service, which is healthcare. And they have an option of 46 different apps. I don't know about you, but there are a lot of smartphones that wouldn't necessarily even hold 46 apps, especially if you're in a low-income household. So it doesn't seem like maybe the best use of everybody's time to be creating new apps everywhere. Would like to say that's no longer the case. They have made some changes, but we're seeing a lot of this is the magic solution and I don't even need to know what the question is. So from my perspective, when we're looking at services and we're looking at taking a human-centered approach, when I say service, I do also include things that you might traditionally call a product. It's something that helps somebody do a thing, so it's a broader definition. But technology of any kind, I would see as a tool rather than a solution. Here is my only picture today, sadly. But here, if I've decided I would quite like to go and eat some sushi today, and go into the restaurant, and I think this is possibly IO sushi. I might sit down, conveyor belt brings me the food. Great. That might be really efficient for me in terms of the time it takes to get me my food. It might be really efficient for the kitchen staff, and it might mean they need less waiting staff on the floor. Is it necessary for me to eat the sushi? No, we have historic ways of getting plates to tables, and that's okay. And in some places, that's going to be the most appropriate approach. So there are circumstances in which it might be good for efficiency, but there are some things that I wouldn't be able to do with a conveyor belt. For example, there might be more fragile dishes. There might be things that need to be cooked to order. There are legitimate reasons why that might not be the solution. So we need to work out what the question is and what the problem is that we're trying to solve to start off. And I think in that space, I think that we have big responsibilities as people who are designing products, services. And the biggest one there is getting the right people in the room. So when I say the right people, mostly I mean people who have lived experience of whatever you're looking at. So for example, let's go back to the sushi restaurant. I probably want to speak to people who eat a lot of sushi, and also people who've never eaten sushi but might want to try someday, because I imagine that conveyor belt is really scary the first time. I want to understand. I might also think about whether people with mobility problems might want to weigh in on how we use conveyor belts. But ultimately, what we want to find is a representative group of people that cover off all of the places where we might be essentially underserving people through those services or through those products. And it's not necessarily about it being representative of the population, but it's about how we integrate them into the design. We also have a responsibility to make space for meaningful participation. And here I've put educating ourselves to remove the facepalm moments. So I think always touched upon kind of reaching out to the communities that we're working to serve essentially in those areas. We need to go with meaningful questions, not with things that we should have known if we'd done a Google search or spoken to somebody who has a bit of experience first. It's incredibly important that we value people's time and their input and their expertise, particularly within minority communities. So that is on us to do. Also, when we're looking at having a representative team, the tech doesn't give people respect, it doesn't give them rights, it doesn't even consider them, it's the people who sit behind it. That is the space that we need to put all of our energy into, and that's why diverse teams who are working with real people are really important. I'm going to take a very quick look at a case study, which maybe gives a little bit less of a rally in the troops and more of a real situation. So looking at the implementation of tech and how sometimes that can be constrained. So I was designing a service that was looking at providing benefits to the people of Scotland. So essentially we'd had powers devolved, and we were looking at doing this in some areas for the first time. We found pretty quickly that a system that we were working with had very limited honorifics. So you could be Mr., you could be Mrs., you could also be like sea captain and professor and things like this. But God forbid you wanted anything that wasn't gendered, that wasn't captain or reverend. So it was a question of, what do we do with this? When we had a little bit of a look, because the first option was we find out what people would like and then we put it in. We found out that we were linking with some legacy technology, and that data was stored in such a way that there was no other option. We would essentially break the system if we tried to add anything in. So we were stuck in a situation of we can use these boxes and we can not respect people's choices, or it's not choices, it's identity, or we look at something else. So what we knew was that increasing numbers of users in the general population were identifying outside of the gender binary, and that those numbers were increasing. So when we looked at younger demographics, we saw much more in terms of a kind of spectrum of gender than we did in the kind of older population. But this was a system that was meant to be serving all of the people of Scotland for the foreseeable future. So it wasn't really an option. So we looked at what we could do and balance that with kind of feasibility. And where we got to was, we'll take them out. We'll take them out entirely. Because we weren't able to provide something that wouldn't be harmful to a group of people. The other people told us essentially in some cases they wanted it, but they weren't that fussed, and lots of people didn't notice. So it tested in the middle ground. Nobody was saying this is the best thing I've ever seen, but nobody was actively harmed by the decision that we made. We heard that within particularly the trans community, there were things that would have been particularly gender affirming for people to have a specific honorific. However, on balance, it was agreed it was the right decision. One last piece that I want to pick up on is that human behaviour always trumps the tech. So the people who were at the other end of the systems, people who were operating it, still wanted to assign a gender to the people they were interacting with. And so we had to do quite a lot of work to make sure that people were well supported with new processes, with different ways of training them. Because if you've been in a customer service role that's meant you have to call somebody sir, for example, that's quite a hard thing to get out of. So we have that to battle, even though it's not within the tech. And just as a last note, nothing's greenfield when it's relying on either legacy data or legacy systems. We have to work with what's already in place. So the idea that AI is suddenly going to magically change these things is not the case unless we're creating entirely new data sets. So as designers, we need to work out how to work with those things and create solutions that work in the meantime and can be aspirational in the future. And at that point, I'm going to stop talking and hand back to Dawn.
Thanks so much, Fiona. That was really interesting, especially seeing from a public sector implementation perspective. It's sometimes, you'll forgive me for saying this, less sexy and less exciting than some of us on the AI side would like to believe it to be. But it's interesting understanding some of the barriers and some of the constraints that you have on the public sector side, especially rolling out stuff that is to meet the needs of the whole of the population of Scotland. So thank you very much. So we're going to move on to a little bit of a discussion. I just thought I would pull out some of the comments from the audience so far. Joanna had a really interesting take earlier on was in some of the things that you were talking about when she's saying it's a really interesting mirror with early sci-fi stories where sci-fi writers can imagine computers and lasers but not women leaders, and yeah, I think we see that quite a lot, and I think there's quite a lot of discussion that we could have around sci-fi's impact on where we're going with certain tech developments now. But what I wanted to ask, while I continue to encourage people to submit their questions, is I couldn't help but notice when the two of you were talking, was that you said a lot of the time human-centered aspects of AI design basically comes at putting a lid on something. And that made me think of the service design principles of building the right thing and building the thing right. And it made me think that actually a lot of human-centered AI design is around building the thing right, but there's not a lot of consideration given to building the right thing. And I wondered if Oz and Fiona, you both maybe had something to say about that.
Oz, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I would agree, both on, yeah, a lot of the time that doesn't seem to be the focus, and also that even when it is the focus, it, you know, as with the like Project Q thing, it tends to be in a very shallow way of like, well, you said that we needed to be trans inclusive, so we asked one trans person if they felt included, and they said yes, to make us leave them alone and stop asking them questions on the street, and so we're good. There is this, I think, tendency to like, what I say is there's this tendency to see in the processes that get like accepted and widely adopted and everything, by definition, it's always going to be whatever change is easiest to stomach. And so I think that it's being executed as, okay, you should change what you do, but the outcomes are exactly the same. Like you're changing the recipe, but not the dish or how it tastes. I think that's not coincidence. I think it's the thing that makes it palatable to a lot of the people with power who need to be convinced. Breaking through that is a much bigger like political philosophy problem that I'm not qualified to answer. But yeah.
Just to jump in on the back of that, I think you're right. Quite often we get dropped into spaces as designers, and there's already an outcome in mind, which can be fine, but it's not particularly fulfilling and it's not particularly ethical work a lot of the time. I think that taking a human-centered approach early in a project or in a space, it requires a significant investment. It requires an investment in truly committing to doing something with what you're finding, which quite often people are not really willing to do, but also potentially to deciding that it's not the right thing. And I think probably what you find there is that there are quite often a lot of other motivations as to why some projects exist. So, for example, as you talked about the queer voice project, and that was funded, and that's a great success to put down as a piece of work that was done, and to show that you're being inclusive, and to turn around and say we spoke to these people and they told us they didn't want it. Personally, as a user-centered professional, I would say that's a win. However, I can see that in some situations that may not be an option. So I think that, yeah, it requires investment, and it also requires quite a lot of commitment to doing something with the information you find.
Fantastic. Yeah, that's some really interesting thoughts there. I'm going to go to some of the questions that we've had from the audience. Oz, this one is from Malcolm. And Malcolm says, the coffee bean analogy that you used makes me think of the truism that we can learn by the experience of other people's experience. We all know that getting an unbiased AI tool is a big ask. How do you see us ensuring that relevant experience and voices are in the AI developments? Do we need quotas or regulatory steps or the likes? And I think, Oz, if you want to answer this, but Fiona, I think you can also speak to this as well.
Yeah, honestly, I mostly defer to Fiona on this, not only because, you know, you actually work in doing these sort of large scale services, and in like, if there are regulatory processes, like you're the one who's had to experience them directly, I just get to sit on the sidelines and throw things, which, you know, is less satisfying a lot of the time. I used to be a software developer, and now I just comment on them. Like the only thing I'd say, I think, is, you know, I think that, yeah, absolutely we need regulation, a lot of regulation around AI. At the same time, I think that, you know, we've known from studies of things like audit culture that for decades that regulation in and of itself is not enough to change practices, and also that the way it changes practices, like, is not what you might expect. Do people start doing the right thing, or do they start filling out all the documentation, proving they did the right thing, and then maybe doing some of the right thing afterwards if they have some time left over from all of the documentation? We know the answer in practice. And I think this highlights like the thing that needs to happen in parallel to this like different regulatory environment and different moral environment, which is also a change in scale. Like there are some systems, like the systems that like Fiona works with, where it's infrastructural. It really is this big thing. It like, you can't get away from the fact that like, if you're designing a benefit system for everyone in Scotland, you kind of can't get a perfectly representative system ever, because it's like you're working with millions upon millions of people. And not only is that too many voices to have in the room, people do this awful thing where they learn and change and grow as you're working. Like, it's like small children. You look away for 2 seconds and suddenly they're gone. And so I think that there are a lot of situations where, however, where that is not the case, and where we genuinely can just scale the problems down and get a lot more representation and inclusion and like sort of ground truth, I guess, like built in, simply by the fact that it doesn't have to be a magic silver bullet that fixes everything for everyone everywhere. It simply can be a thing that works for 300 people in Perth, and that's enough, because those 300 people in Perth like are a particular community or articulate themselves in a particular way. And we don't do this, I think, in part because the way we talk about AI, right? Like the things that make a project like big and interesting and cool are about scale of impact. And, you know, it's about, oh, I changed 5 million people's lives last week, not I had an impact on 20 people. To be honest, I don't know what exactly the impact is. I will find out next week at the meeting. People like to you know, tell heroic stories and to build heroic things. And frankly, the world needs a lot fewer heroes and a lot less trying to design for everything, a lot more small scale stuff. And in terms of, but in terms of like, you know, what we do for those systems that are more infrastructural, the systems where you just can't scale it down to 300 people, you really do need something that's compatible everywhere. I think that another aspect there that goes beyond regulation and is about cultural change is sort of embracing contingency. There's this tendency in design in a lot of, although it, you know, changes in different institutional environments, to be like, okay, you built the thing, so now it's done, right? And it's like, no, because it's contingent. It's, I built the thing and now it's done until any other system that it integrates with changes, or any other person changes. And we've learned these lessons with software development, right? But it feels like, again, people are approaching AI as if it is such a new thing that we've thrown out this all-important lesson of like, you're never going to be done. You're never going to be done with representation, with accuracy or inaccuracy, with discriminatory coverage or anything else. Like, you can have the regulatory environment, but what you also need is this awareness from the get-go that like, there's no off switch for this except the literal off switch. Like, once you start doing a project, you have to at every point either be comfortable throwing it away or investing more time adapting it to the latest thing that happened. And that kind of long-term planning is both necessary and I think a thing that isn't really talked about enough. Okay, I'm going to shut up now.
And Dawn, is there time for me to just quickly pick up on that question?
Yeah, we've still got time.
Yeah. So quotas, briefly, hate them. Best ways not to add quotas. They tend to be misused. Also, anybody who's ever done any kind of participation or research directly with people in what might be termed a kind of hard to reach or easy to ignore group knows that notoriously it's quite hard work to find people, and what that results in is a small group of people being really over relied on for research, and they become basically professional research participants. They're not representative of people anymore. Once they've engaged with you a certain number of times, it might as well be somebody else or nobody at all. You know what they're going to say. Also, sometimes they think they know what you want to hear, and therefore will tell you that. So quotas, probably for my 2 cents, not the way to go. Regulatory steps, I think ultimately we probably want to just be reinforcing people's rights across the entire spectrum of humanity. I think that we need to look at how we put those things into practice. So there's a lot of legislation about how we treat people in, I suppose, normal day-to-day life. We see less of that enforced in digital spaces. I think that the best way to ensure that we are being representative in development of AI or any kind of technology is to make sure that we've got diverse teams that will spot when something is potentially going to be a problem. I know fine well, historically, there are projects I've worked on where I have been the person in the room saying, I don't think that language is going to be great for trans people, or I don't think that that's actually going to include same-sex parents. And that wasn't necessarily because I have all of those characteristics or any of those characteristics, but it's because I'm part of the queer community and can recognise that. The same will go if you're somebody with a different life experience, maybe you're kid experienced or you have English as a second language. You will spot things that I don't. And those are the people that we need in the room so that they can get rid of the face-palm moments, and so that they can point us to places where we need to dig deeper for participation. So I suppose my main answer there is it needs to be representative all the way up and all the way down.
Thanks for that, Fiona. We actually had an interesting point raised by Ricky Holtz, which sort of leads into what you were talking about. Ricky says, is the shallowness of this sort of the shallowness of the involvement that we're getting a result of queerness being understudied or underrepresented? Ricky points out that it reminds me of Margaret Cho's series, in which was a kind of precursor to Fresh Off the Boat, a sitcom about an Asian American family. She was essentially saying that they only had the capacity to tell one story, but all Asian American communities had to go to one place to see themselves represented, and it couldn't represent all of their stories. And also noting that it seems like there's some natural limits to the capacity of a single project. And that all of a community's expectations start getting heaped onto that project. How fair or sustainable can that be? So I think there's quite a few things in there, but do we think that part of this issue is a lack of study or representation of queerness in the design process? Or is it about, as Fiona touched on, the same sorts of queerness being represented and therefore the same story being told consistently over and over again? Oz, do you want to?
I suspect that Fiona's answer on this is, as it's consistently been, going to be a way better than mine, so I'm just going to defer.
Oh no, I feel like you've set me up for failure now, Oz. That's okay. I think that it's probably a combination of both. So what we see in, I suppose, what we see in that kind of design space for tech is a representation of what else is happening in the world, right? So these are real people live in the world with real jobs. It's just that all those jobs happen to be together. And I think that depending on a lot of mass media, to be perfectly honest, it depends the issues that we're conscious of. Like personally, I've seen a big shift to consideration of different types of queerness over time, as people start to be more comfortable and understand, well, a couple of things. One of them is what people, I suppose, what those groups look like, but also where they are in spaces where they feel like they might be comfortable to ask questions. But I think ultimately for me, it comes back to that representation inside and out. I think that everything tends to be very reductive. So like that, the intersectionality of people tends to be ignored. So like that, we've talked about queerness a lot. We haven't talked about queerness and other things. Like you can be multiple types of queer, but you also might have other things that impact how you move through the world and the privilege you experience or not. And I think that that's the place where we start to break down. I think we've gotten better at the small segments, but the intersectionality is the piece where it falls down. I think that we only get that through engaging with the right kinds of people, but part of that is also developing trust for people to share those stories with us. So I think as any kind of organisation that's doing that work, the most important thing is to start to practice what you preach, turn that stuff inside, get those people inside and start to show that you're actually listening to what people are saying, and then you get much more information, which hopefully starts to stop that cycle of here's your one thing and here's the answer and we're done.
Fantastic, Fiona, thanks very much. And that just brings us quite nicely up to 5 o'clock as well. So well done. That's been really, really interesting presentation and discussion from both Oz and Fiona. And thank you to everybody who contributed in the chat as well. I'm sorry that we didn't get to everybody's questions. It's just big questions with big answers, maybe a little bit too much to squeeze into 1 hour. So with that being said, I just want to remind everybody again that our next event for the Scottish AI event series is on NLP and its uses in education, healthcare and business, and that will be on the 19th of July at 12:30. And hopefully we'll be dropping a link in the chat just now for you to sign up. I'd just like to thank Oz and Fiona for coming along and for giving their time and their really detailed and interesting insights into this. And I'd like to thank everybody else for joining us as well on this afternoon and for submitting your questions and your comments. I see that there's some emails being dropped in the chat for further discussion. So yeah, I look forward to seeing some of you at the next event that we have in July. And until then, thank you so much for coming along and for taking part in this afternoon's event.